The rain had been relentless, a constant drumming on the windows of the old manor. Dark clouds hung low over the countryside, and the flickering light of a solitary candle seemed to shrink in the face of the storm outside. Inside, the grand drawing room of Everbrook Manor appeared more like a museum than a home. Its heavy, velvet drapes, ancient portraits, and an array of dusty antiques giving it a sense of frozen time. The evening seemed perfectly ordinary until the discovery of the body. Inspector Philip Larkin stood still at the center of the room, staring down at the scene before him. It was a locked room mystery, the kind he had hoped to leave behind when he retired, but fate had other plans. The victim, Lord Arthur Rivington, lay sprawled in front of the fireplace, his body stiff and cold. There were no obvious signs of a struggle, no bruises, no blood, no weapons scattered around. The only peculiar thing was the absence of any apparent cause of death. Larkin crouched down and examined the body with careful precision. Lord Rivington had been well respected, a man of wealth and influence, and there had been no indication that anyone wished him harm. Yet, here he was lying lifeless in the heart of his own home, without a single clue to explain how or why. The room itself was locked from the inside, and the only entrance, a heavy wooden door with brass handles, was still sealed. The windows, large and arched, were shut tight, with no sign of tampering. Larkin's mind churned with questions. How had the murderer entered? And more importantly, how had they left? Nothing made sense. The most confounding detail, however, was the clue, an ivory chess piece. A knight, left sitting upright in the middle of the room, a mere foot away from the victim's body. It seemed entirely out of place, an innocent object, one you'd expect to find on a chessboard, not as a message or an omen. Was it some kind of code, a symbol of power or a reference to an old game? Or was it just the product of a deranged mind, trying to confuse anyone who came across it? Larkin's eyes narrowed. It was too easy to dismiss the piece as random. There had to be something more to it. Lord Rivington was known for his love of games, particularly chess, and had often hosted weekly matches at the manor. But this piece had not been part of the game. It was old, tarnished, and carved from the finest ivory. Unlike any piece found in Rivington's collection, someone had placed it there intentionally. As a sign or a challenge, Larkin stood up slowly, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, and surveyed the room once more. It was a crime that seemed to defy logic, a puzzle that would take everything he had to solve. The victim's servants had all been questioned, but they had little to offer. No one had seen or heard anything unusual, just the steady rain and the usual sounds of the manor. He glanced toward the windows again. There were no marks on the glass, no fingerprints on the door handles. It was as if the murderer had vanished into thin air. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Inspector," said Constable Williams, entering the room with a somber expression. "We've completed our search of the rest of the house. No sign of forced entry. No one left or entered the manor." After dinner, Larkin nodded, deep in thought. "What about the other rooms? Any unusual findings?" "Nothing that stands out, sir. The library is as tidy as always, and the kitchen is untouched. The only thing that seems out of place is the chessboard in the study. It was left unfinished, pieces scattered across it. Some moved in odd directions, almost as if the game had been interrupted abruptly." Larkin's pulse quickened. The chessboard. He had to see it. He followed Williams down the hallway, passing portraits of long-dead Rivington ancestors who seemed to watch their every move. The study was at the far end of the manor, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dark, save for the soft glow of a desk lamp. The chessboard, as Williams had mentioned, sat on the large oak desk, pieces scattered across its surface. Larkin approached slowly, his eyes scanning the board. It was a strange position. Some pieces were knocked over as if in haste, but others were carefully placed, deliberately moved. The white knight was closest to the center, and in an oddly symmetrical arrangement. The black king was positioned directly across from it. There was no question now. The knight on the floor was no random object. It had a meaning. Larkin's fingers brushed the chess pieces on the board, and a sudden realization hit him. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate, like a message. Could the game be a metaphor, a clue hidden within the moves themselves? He turned back to Williams. Get me the family history. I need to know if any of Rivington's ancestors were prominent chess players, or if there's any record of unusual games in this manner. As Williams left to retrieve the requested documents, Larkin's thoughts returned to the Ivory night. Why had it been left in such a conspicuous position? A lone figure in a room that spoke of forgotten games? Was it part of the game, or was it a message to Larkin himself? The case was unlike any other he had encountered. An enigma wrapped in an unsolvable puzzle. But he was not one to back down from a challenge. He would unravel the meaning behind the chessboard, piece by piece, even if it meant diving deeper into a past riddled with secrets, lies, and long-buried rivalries. The rain continued to beat against the windows, and the manor seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for Larkin to uncover the truth that was locked within its walls. The game had only just begun. Hours had passed, and still, the manor seemed to hold its breath. The flickering light from the desk lamp cast long shadows across the study as Larkin stood deep in thought. The chessboard had offered its riddle, but it was no closer to yielding its secrets. Every move felt like a clue, yet it refused to make sense. Just then, the quiet shuffle of footsteps reached his ears. He turned to find the butler, Mr. Clements, standing in the doorway. His normally calm demeanor had an edge of nervousness tonight. His hands clasped tightly behind his back. "Inspector," Clements said, voice steady but with a hint of unease. "The family history you requested, as well as a few other things I thought might be of interest, have been gathered." He held out a thick folder. "If you'd like, I can show you to the library." Larkin took the folder, nodding absently as he glanced back at the chessboard. "Thank you, Clements. I'll come by shortly." "Just a moment more here." The butler lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something more, then turned and disappeared down the hallway. Larkin's mind was racing. He felt a growing sense of urgency, as if the manor itself was pressing in on him, its walls whispering secrets he couldn't yet grasp. As the door clicked shut behind the butler, Larkin heard another set of footsteps approaching. A small figure appeared in the doorway. Miss Evelyn Rivington, the youngest daughter of the late Lord Arthur. She was dressed in black, her face pale, but it was the eyes that held Larkin's attention. There was something about them, something calculating beneath the surface, like a woman who had learned the art of hiding her emotions under layers of politeness. "Inspector, I thought you might be here," she said softly, stepping into the room. She didn't wait for an invitation, her gaze fixed on the chessboard with an almost unreadable expression. "It's dreadful, isn't it? I can't believe Father's gone." Larkin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, the slight tremor in her hands, the faintest flutter of her eyelids when her gaze landed on the chessboard. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Larkin's instincts kicked in. There was something here, something she was trying to hide. He tilted his head slightly, keeping his voice measured. "It is indeed a tragedy, Miss Rivington. But I wonder, do you play chess?" Evelyn's eyes flickered to the chessboard for a moment before returning to him. She smiled faintly, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "I have played. Occasionally. My father and I would sometimes have matches when I was younger, and yet," Larkin continued, "there's something unusual about the way the pieces are arranged. Almost as if it's not a game, but a message." He watched closely as her expression hardened, her jaw tightening for the briefest of seconds. "I wouldn't know about that, Inspector," she replied coolly. "Perhaps the killer left their own mark, in some way. Perhaps they thought it was clever." Larkin gave her a sharp look, then turned his attention back to the chessboard. Something about her words didn't sit right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way she said them, to controlled, to practiced. As if she had rehearsed them. The detective stepped closer to the board. "It's curious," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A knight left, so precisely placed, and yet no other piece seems to align. It's almost as if—" He paused, searching her face for any sign of recognition. "Almost as if it were meant to lead me somewhere." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, and she shifted uncomfortably. "You must forgive me, Inspector. I'm not a detective. I hardly understand the nuances of such things." Larkin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to stretch, watching as the tension in Evelyn's posture subtly increased. Then, with deliberate care, he reached forward and picked up the ivory knight. He held it between his fingers, turning it over in his hand. The weight of it felt solid, substantial, yet there was something about its wear, the scratches along its base, that suggested it had been moved frequently. "You've seen this chess set before, Miss Rivington?" Larkin asked, his voice low. Evelyn stiffened, her lips pressing together as if she were debating something. "Yes, I've seen it," she said after a moment, though her voice lacked conviction. Larkin's gaze never left her face as he set the knight back onto the board, just a fraction off-center. "And when was the last time you saw it?" "Yesterday, at dinner," she replied quickly, too quickly. The detective could feel the weight of her hesitation in her words, the tiny crack in her calm facade. It was barely noticeable, but it was there, just a flicker in her eyes, the slightest tremor in her fingers. He studied her for a moment longer before straightening up. "I see," he said, the barest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Thank you, Miss Rivington. That will be all for now." She looked like she was about to say something more, but thought better of it. With a small nod, she turned and left, the door closing softly behind her. Larkin remained standing in front of the chessboard, feeling the weight of the silence settle around him. He couldn't explain why, but he had the distinct sense that Evelyn knew more than she let on. There was something in her behavior, a faint, fleeting moment of guilt, perhaps, or a slip in her composure that she was desperately trying to cover. The way she reacted to the mention of the chess set, the subtle way she avoided answering his questions directly, it all pointed to one thing: deception. The question was, how deep did it run? Larkin stood there for a few moments longer, weighing his options. He had no proof, no concrete reason to suspect her, yet his instinct screamed that Evelyn was hiding something. There was no time to waste. He turned and walked out of the study, heading toward the library where Clemens had left the family records. He would sift through them, uncover the connections, and find the truth buried beneath the surface. But one thing was clear: Lord Rivington's death was no simple tragedy. It was the beginning of something far darker, a mystery that would unfold, piece by piece, each new revelation bringing him closer to the heart of the deception that had been carefully crafted in the shadows of Everbrook Manor. The library was dim, the heavy drapes drawn tightly against the storm outside. The smell of old books and polished wood filled the air, and the quiet ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo the slow passage of time. Inspector Larkin sat at a long oak table, the family records spread out before him, letters, journals, and documents. Each piece told a story, but none seemed to fit the puzzle he was trying to solve. He flicked through the pages with a deliberate slowness, his mind racing as he sifted through generations of history, family politics, and old feuds. The Rivington family was one of the oldest in the region, with a history that stretched back hundreds of years. The records told of a proud lineage, of wealth and influence, but there were gaps, discrepancies in the stories, unusual absences in the family tree. Larkin had noted a few names that had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and there was something odd about the way certain generations seemed to have either overextended themselves or been cut short. Still, nothing concrete, nothing to link directly to Lord Arthur's death, at least not yet. His musings were interrupted by the soft tap of footsteps on the library floor. He looked up to see Mr. Clemens, the butler, standing at the doorway, his posture stiff, almost formal. "Inspector, Miss Evelyn has requested a meeting with you," Clemens said, his voice as neutral as ever. "She wishes to speak with you privately." Larkin's gaze sharpened. Evelyn Rivington had left the study only an hour ago, and now she wanted to talk. It seemed odd, to eager, almost, but he nodded curtly and rose from his seat. "Very well, show her in." Clemens stepped aside, allowing Evelyn to enter. She was still dressed in her morning clothes, though there was a distinct change in her demeanor now, no longer the cool, collected woman who had sat across from him earlier. Evelyn now looked a little less composed, a little more fragile, but her eyes were still sharp, her every movement calculated. "Inspector," she began, her voice soft, I wanted to apologize for my earlier behavior. I realize now that I may have seemed somewhat defensive. It's just that the shock of losing father so suddenly, Well, it's been difficult to process. I wanted to make sure you had all the information you needed. Perhaps I can help you with the investigation." Her words were carefully measured, but there was an undertone of something else, something unspoken. Larkin observed her for a moment before responding. "I appreciate your offer, Miss Rivington. However, the investigation proceeds on facts, not gestures. You understand that, of course." Her lips quirked slightly, as if to suppress a smile. "Of course, Inspector, but surely I can provide some clarity. I've been thinking about the events of the night father's last moments, and perhaps there's something I can add to your understanding of the situation." Larkin didn't respond immediately. Instead, he waited, watching her, his mind flicking through the inconsistencies he had already noted. There was something about her presence, a faint undercurrent of tension that suggested she wasn't as calm as she appeared. Finally, he spoke. "I would appreciate any information you have, Miss Rivington. But I must ask, where were you exactly when your father died?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering to the side before locking with his. "I was in my room," she said, her voice steady. "I had been reading, and I had no reason to leave. The storm was growing worse by the minute, and I didn't wish to disturb anyone." Larkin nodded slowly, but her story felt rehearsed. He allowed the silence to stretch for a moment before speaking again. "Did anyone else see you in your room? Can anyone corroborate your story?" Evelyn's gaze never wavered, but there was a slight tightening around her jaw. "No, I prefer solitude when I read. And as for anyone else seeing me, well, I suppose no one can confirm it. But I didn't leave my room." Larkin's eyes narrowed. Something in her tone didn't quite match her words. "I see. And what of the chess set in the study? Your father's last game, was that not something you and he often played?" Evelyn's expression shifted, just slightly. Her lips parted, as if she were about to say something, then closed again. Finally, she spoke. "Father was passionate about his games, but I had no interest in them in the last few years. I think you might find that he played alone. Quite often. I didn't even know he had left a game unfinished." Larkin leaned forward slightly, narrowing the distance between them. "And yet, you were familiar enough with the chessboard to comment on it earlier. What makes you so certain it was your father's game?" Evelyn blinked, taken aback for a fraction of a second, but quickly regained her composure. I'm sorry, Inspector. I was mistaken." Larkin didn't move. "You don't seem the type to make such mistakes, Miss Rivington. You knew something. But what?" Evelyn's eyes darted to the side again. This time, there was no hiding it. The hesitation was clear. Her next words came slowly, carefully chosen. "I didn't mean to imply anything suspicious," she said, a little too quickly. "I was only trying to be helpful." Larkin didn't press further. He could feel the tension in the room, the weight of her deception hovering just below the surface. But he also knew that pushing too hard now might cause her to retreat further, into her shell. He needed to be patient. One slip, one crack in her story, and the truth would be revealed. "Very well," he said, standing up. "If you think of anything else that might be relevant, do let me know." Evelyn stood, her movements still graceful despite the tension hanging in the air. She gave him a tight smile. "Of course, Inspector. I only want to help." As she left the library, Larkin stayed where he was for a moment, his thoughts swirling. Evelyn's story didn't add up. There were too many contradictions in her account, too many holes. But what was she hiding, and why was she so eager to help? Before he could dwell on the questions further, he was interrupted by another visitor this time. It was a figure he hadn't yet spoken to in any detail, George, the groundskeeper. He had been a quiet presence in the background during the earlier interviews, but Larkin had noticed that George's movements seemed too deliberate, his eyes too watchful. He was a man who knew more than he let on, and Larkin was ready to get answers. "Inspector," George said, stepping into the library with a slow, deliberate pace, his boots heavy on the floor. "I thought you might want to hear my side of things." Larkin's eyes flickered with curiosity, and he gestured for George to sit. "Go ahead, then," he said, watching carefully. "Tell me what happened that night." George settled into the chair across from Larkin, his large, calloused hands folding neatly in his lap. The groundskeeper had the look of a man who had spent years in the shadow of others. Someone who knew the land like the back of his hand but avoided the spotlight. His gaze flicked to the window for a brief moment, as if he could still hear the rain slashing against the panes. It was almost as if he were waiting for the storm to pass before speaking. Larkin studied him carefully, his mind sifting through the other conversations he had already had that day. There were so many pieces to this puzzle, but none of them seemed to fit perfectly together. The contradictions between the statements of the various witnesses, the deliberate omissions, the strange calmness from some of the household, and the anxiety from others, it was all leading somewhere. But where? Finally, George spoke, his voice deep and slow, as though carefully choosing each word. "The night your master was found, I was in the stables. It was a storm, and I was keeping the horses in. We've had trouble with the gates before, especially during weather like this. I was busy tending to the animals." Larkin nodded, his eyes never leaving George's face. "Did anyone see you at the stables? Anyone at all?" George shifted slightly, his gaze steady but not unwavering. "No, sir. No one comes around the stables in that kind of weather. I was alone." The detective didn't press further on that point. George's alibi was simple, and Larkin was inclined to believe it. Still, the groundskeeper's reluctance to offer much detail made Larkin cautious. "You've been in the Rivington family's service for many years, haven't you?" George replied, his tone flat. "Nearly 20. Quite a long time," Larkin mused. "And in all that time, have you ever noticed any tensions between Lord Arthur and his family?" The groundskeeper stiffened at the question, his face momentarily betraying a flicker of something, fear, or perhaps guilt, before it quickly smoothed over into indifference. "There's always tensions in a big house like this, sir. But I don't get involved in the family's business." Larkin's gaze sharpened. "But you must have seen something, overheard something. No family is without its secrets." George looked down at his hands, and for a long moment there was silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower now, as if the walls themselves were listening. "There were rumors. People said things. The master was having problems with the family, I mean." Larkin leaned forward. "What kind of problems?" "Money troubles," George muttered. "Things were tight, and the old estate wasn't making as much as it used to. Word was, Lord Arthur was making plans to sell off some of the land to cover debts. Not that the family would ever admit it, of course." He cleared his throat. "But it's not just that." Larkin's pulse quickened. "What else?" "There was talk of a will," George continued, glancing around the room, as though half expecting someone to overhear. "A new will. Some said he was leaving everything to Miss Evelyn, but others thought he might have changed his mind." Larkin's mind immediately latched onto the mention of a will. It was always the way with these cases. Money was often the thread that unraveled everything. And in a family as wealthy and influential as the Rivingtons, the question of inheritance was never simple. But something didn't sit right. George had said, some said, and others thought he was giving Larkin only pieces, and Larkin needed the whole picture. "I see," Larkin said, his voice low and deliberate. "Did anyone else know about this will?" George hesitated, and Larkin could see the man's discomfort growing. "I don't know for certain, but there were rumors. People talk in this house. Miss Evelyn's been, well, she's been trying to make herself useful lately. More than usual, I mean. I don't know if she knew about the will, but she seemed interested, if you catch my drift." Larkin's eyes narrowed. "Interested in what way?" George shifted uncomfortably, his hands now clenched together. "It's just a feeling, sir, nothing concrete. But the way she kept looking at her father's desk, going through his papers when she thought no one was watching, it made me wonder." Larkin was already mentally compiling the information George had given him. If Evelyn had known about the will, that could give her a very clear motive. But was it just her? Larkin couldn't forget the strange behavior he'd witnessed earlier, her eagerness to help, her almost too perfect explanations. The contradictions between her story and her emotions made her a prime suspect, but there was something more that didn't fit. "Thank you, George," Larkin said, his voice turning cold. "You've been helpful." The groundskeeper stood, clearly relieved to be excused. "I'm just saying what I know, sir. Don't take my word for it. I'm no detective." Larkin watched as George left the room, his mind churning with the new information, greed, inheritance, debts. These were all powerful motives, and they painted Evelyn in a suspicious light. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What if someone else in the family had a reason to act against Lord Arthur? What about Miss Olivia, the older daughter? She had been quiet throughout the investigation, but Larkin couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. It was time to start sorting through the tangled web of alibis, motives, and lies. Every person in this household seemed to have their own reason for involvement, but no single theory could explain everything. There was a delicate balance here. Each motive had to be weighed carefully, the connections scrutinized with precision. As Larkin returned to the study to revisit the chessboard, he considered the next step. He had to meet with Olivia, and he had to speak again with Clemence. The butler's role in all of this was still unclear. His loyalty to the family had been unquestioned, but the way he had subtly avoided certain questions gave Larkin pause. There was something he wasn't saying, something important. The detective could feel the walls of the manor closing in around him. Each suspect, each witness, had a reason to be involved, but none of their stories were complete. One of them was lying, perhaps more than one. But Larkin knew it was the web of deception. He had to untangle one thread at a time. And he would. He had to. Because somewhere, buried beneath all these tangled motives, was the truth. And it was only a matter of time before it all came to light. The storm had finally subsided by the time Larkin made his way back to the drawing room. He was tired, his mind heavy with the weight of conflicting stories. But there was something still gnawing at him, something he couldn't shake. Each piece of the puzzle he had gathered over the past few days seemed to fit together, just not in the way he expected. He had just finished speaking with Olivia Rivington, who had given him little of substance, but enough to raise his suspicions. She had played her part perfectly, sitting straight-backed and calm, but there was a distinct coldness to her, one that felt rehearsed. Her alibi checked out, though, as did the others. It seemed like every suspect had a plausible story, but each one lacked the depth Larkin needed. To convenient. Then, just as he was about to leave the study and return to his thoughts, a knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. The constable, Williams, entered, holding a thick envelope with an air of urgency. "Inspector, you'll want to see this." Williams handed him the envelope, a look of excitement in his eyes. Larkin took it slowly, his brow furrowing as he examined the seal. "What is it?" "The forensics team, sir. They've found something that might solve the case." Larkin opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a report on a piece of evidence. They had recovered from the scene a set of fingerprints on the chessboard. The prints didn't match any of the household members. In fact, they were an exact match to one of the local estate workers, a man by the name of Samuel Frost, who had been employed as a gardener at Everbrook Manor until a few months prior. Larkin's pulse quickened. A breakthrough. They had a suspect, Samuel Frost, Williams said, his voice rising with the thrill of the discovery. The prints were found on the ivory knight just where the killer must have placed it. Larkin stood motionless for a moment, his mind racing. He had learned enough over the past few days to know that no one was ever as simple as they appeared. But a man with a known connection to the estate, and one whose prints were found on the chess piece, it seemed to clean, to perfect. "Get the team ready," Larkin said, already heading for the door. "We'll pay Mr. Frost a visit." The drive to the small cottage where Samuel Frost lived was quick, and Larkin found himself staring out of the carriage window, trying to piece together the growing mass of details in his mind. The chess piece, the fingerprints, the connection to the manor, it was all starting to fit. But something about it bothered him. He couldn't help but feel that the revelation was too neat, too convenient. When they arrived, Larkin wasted no time. He instructed Williams to wait outside while he entered the cottage alone. The door was ajar, and a faint smell of tobacco and damp wood filled the air. Inside, the small room was sparsely furnished, with a few battered chairs and a table cluttered with gardening tools. Frost was sitting in the corner, his back to the door. The man was a large, burly figure, his hands rough from years of manual labor. He turned slowly as Larkin stepped into the room. His face was weathered, his eyes heavy-lidded, as though he had been expecting this moment for some time. "Inspector," Frost said, his voice low but steady, "I've been waiting for you." Larkin didn't speak right away. He studied the man before him, noting the way his broad shoulders seemed to tense at the sound of his name. There was no fear in Frost's face, just a resigned calm. Larkin felt the familiar stirrings of doubt. It was too easy. He didn't look like a man who was caught off guard, but rather like a man who had been anticipating his fate. "You know why I'm here, Frost," Larkin said, his voice quiet but firm. Frost nodded. "I suppose I do. Your prints were found on the chess piece at Everbrook Manor," Larkin continued, watching for any sign of reaction. "You were there the night Lord Arthur died. Tell me why." Frost shifted in his chair, but didn't answer immediately. His gaze remained steady, never flinching. After a moment, he sighed, as though the truth had been eating at him. "I didn't kill him, Inspector," he said slowly, his voice heavy with something close to regret. "But I was there, yes. I was there the night Lord Arthur died." Larkin waited, not speaking, allowing the silence to stretch between them. He could feel the tension building, the weight of the man's confession hanging in the air. "I used to work at the manor," Frost said, his eyes not meeting Larkin's. "Not for long, just a few months before I left. I didn't have any trouble with Lord Arthur, but there were rumors. People talked about money, about his debts, about a will that he was planning to change. It wasn't something I wanted to be a part of, so I left, but I was still close to the place, and when I heard about the murder, well, I couldn't stay away." Larkin's mind raced. Frost had no obvious motive. He was a man who had left the estate months ago, with no apparent ties to the family. But why had his prints been on the chess piece, and why hadn't anyone seen him at the manor? "Why were your fingerprints on the night then?" Larkin pressed. "What were you doing there?" Frost looked up at him then, his face darkening. "I didn't mean to be found. I went to the manor that night, not to kill Lord Arthur, but to find out if the rumors were true. I heard from a fellow worker that the will had been changed, and I wanted to see for myself. I found the chessboard in the study, and I was there when he was killed." Larkin's heart skipped a beat. "You were there when he died?" he asked, his voice rising. Frost nodded slowly. "Yes, but I didn't kill him. I swear it." Larkin's mind was spinning now. He had a confession, of sorts, but it wasn't the one he had hoped for. Something didn't add up. If Frost had been there, and hadn't killed Lord Arthur, who had? And why had he left his prints behind? Frost's gaze darkened. "You'll think I'm lying, Inspector. But I'm not. I didn't kill him. But I do." "Know who did?" Larkin felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "Who?" Frost's eyes flickered with a knowing look, but before he could speak, a loud crash echoed from outside the cottage. Both men froze, the sound of a door slamming open followed by hurried footsteps. Larkin's instincts kicked in. Without another word, he dashed for the door, pushing it open just in time to see a figure fleeing into the woods that the chase had begun. Again, Larkin's pulse quickened. He knew, deep down, that this breakthrough, this false victory, had just exposed a far deeper truth. The criminal had been hiding in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. And now, the game had truly begun. The figure disappeared into the woods so quickly that for a moment, Larkin thought he might have imagined it. The damp evening air hung thick around him as he dashed out of the cottage, barely pausing to gather his bearings. Frost's last words echoed in his mind, a strange whisper in the back of his thoughts. "I do know who did it." But the fleeting figure in the woods seemed to have evaporated, vanishing into the shadows like a ghost. Larkin cursed under his breath. He had no time to waste. Frost's cryptic confession was both a lead and a dead end. The gardener had said he hadn't killed Lord Arthur, yet he knew who had. If Frost had seen something, then it was crucial to get him to speak. But the chase had to come first. "Williams!" Larkin shouted, running toward the constable, who had been stationed by the carriage. The constable stood frozen, wide-eyed, watching the woods where the figure had vanished. He looked back at Larkin, waiting for instructions. "Get the team," Larkin ordered. "We're going after him. He's our only lead." The hunt through the darkened woods was frantic, the underbrush snapping underfoot. The damp earth sucking at their boots, the thick trees, and the fading light of dusk made it almost impossible to keep track of the figure. But Larkin pushed on, his heart pounding in his chest. The unknown figure had to have been connected to the crime. There was no other explanation. And yet, Larkin couldn't shake the nagging sense that the night had taken a turn that he wasn't quite ready for. Minutes turned into hours, the search turning up nothing. The figure had disappeared completely, exhausted and defeated. Larkin returned to the manor with Williams. His mind was a swirl of thoughts, all of them pointing toward one thing. They were missing something important. The figure was just another distraction. They had been chasing shadows, but the truth lay elsewhere. Back at the manor, Larkin took a moment to collect his thoughts. He had to focus. The breakthrough they thought they had with Samuel Frost had led nowhere, and now, the chase through the woods had yielded nothing. But there was one detail, one that had been hovering on the edges of his consciousness ever since the beginning of this investigation, a detail that had now become inescapable. He sat down at the desk in the study, his eyes scanning the papers, the chessboard still in place. The ivory knight that had been left so carefully on the floor, a message, a clue, perhaps. It seemed like such a simple thing. But Larkin had learned by now that simplicity was often a cover for something deeper, something buried. And as his eyes flicked back to the documents on Lord Arthur's desk, a name caught his attention. The name was old, far older than the events surrounding the murder. It was the name of a distant relative of the Rivingtons, a cousin by the name of Henrietta Rivington. Larkin's fingers hovered over the name as the pieces of the puzzle slowly began to fall into place. Henrietta Rivington. The woman had died in a mysterious drowning years ago, a case that had been quietly closed, with no explanation. Larkin had read through the case files when he'd first arrived at Everbrook Manor, but it had seemed unrelated. Now, however, with everything that had happened, it was impossible not to draw the connection. The Rivington family's legacy was built on secrets, and those secrets ran deep. Larkin's pulse quickened as he recalled the faint mention of Henrietta. In the conversations with the suspects, it had been brief, almost an afterthought, but it was there. Evelyn had been particularly evasive when Larkin had casually asked about the past. Her reaction had been subtle but telling. And then there was the matter of the chessboard. Lord Arthur had played often. Yes, but why leave a piece from an old set? One that looked so out of place among the others. A hidden connection, perhaps. Something that tied Henrietta Rivington to the events unfolding now. Williams, Larkin said sharply, calling for the constable. I need you to gather the staff. We're going to have a word with Miss Evelyn. And make sure we're not disturbed. As they assembled in the study, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Evelyn entered, her expression once again a perfect mask of composure, though Larkin could tell she was nervous. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Miss Rivington, Larkin said, his voice steady but commanding. I need to ask you about Henrietta Rivington. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough. Henrietta, she repeated, her tone carefully neutral. What on earth would she have to do with my father's death? Larkin leaned in slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. You tell me, you seem, well, remarkably uninterested in your family's past. Henrietta's death was ruled an accident and unfortunate drowning. But I believe there's more to it. I believe it has something to do with your father and the way he was caught up in that whole mess. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, her composure cracked, and Larkin saw in a flash of something dark in her eyes, something like fear. I don't know what you're talking about, Inspector, she said, her voice a little too tight. Henrietta's death was tragic, but it has nothing to do with father's passing. Why are you bringing it up now? Larkin's hand hovered near the chessboard, the pieces still neatly arranged in their positions. He picked up the ivory knight, examining it closely. It was an old piece, worn and weathered, not one that would typically belong to a current set, a relic, perhaps, from another time. He turned to Evelyn, who was standing stiffly by the window, watching him with wary eyes. Your father, Miss Rivington, he didn't just care about the estate. He cared about something else. He had a secret one that wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about Henrietta, wasn't it? You're trying to hide something. But it's all here, the connections, the lies, Evelyn's shoulders slumped, her breath shaky. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Henrietta was everything to him. And everything about that accident. It was never an accident. It was murder. And my father." She trailed off, her face pale, as though she could hardly bear to speak the words. Larkin placed the knight down gently. "Your father killed Henrietta, didn't he?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately, but her silence was the confirmation he needed. Larkin's mind was already racing, piecing the events together with a clarity he hadn't had before. The past had come to the surface, and it was tangled with the present in ways no one had expected. Lord Arthur had murdered his cousin Henrietta years ago, and now Evelyn, his daughter, had taken matters into her own hands. The game had always been more than just about power. It had been about secrets, buried in the past, and the lengths someone would go to keep them hidden. The true motive had always been there, waiting in the shadows. And now Larkin knew that the final revelation was within his grasp. But he still had one more question. Who was the real victim in this game of deception? Was it the innocent, or was it the man who thought he could bury the truth forever? The pieces were falling into place, and with every step closer to the truth, the darkness surrounding the Rivington family grew deeper. The tension in the study was palpable, the air thick with unspoken truths and lingering fears. Evelyn's confession hung between them like a dark cloud, a heavy weight that threatened to crush the fragile veneer of the Rivington family's reputation. But despite the shock of her words, Larkin's mind was already shifting, recalibrating. He had known that there was more to the case than it first appeared. The murder of Lord Arthur wasn't just about inheritance or family rivalry. It was about something deeper, something that had been buried for years. Evelyn stood motionless, her hands trembling at her sides, her eyes darting nervously as she looked anywhere but at Larkin. She had confessed, but there was something about her demeanor that still didn't sit right. The detective had learned over the years to trust his instincts, and right now, his gut was telling him that the confession, though genuine in parts, was incomplete. "Miss Rivington," Larkin said slowly, his voice calm but firm, "I don't think you're telling me everything. You say your father killed Henrietta, your cousin, and yet you've never once mentioned a motive. Why would Lord Arthur kill his own family?" Her face paled even further. If that was possible. She opened her mouth to speak but faltered, as if the words she needed were suddenly unreachable. Larkin knew the silence was just as telling as her words had been. She wasn't just withholding facts, she was trying to control the narrative, to steer the conversation where it suited her. Larkin had no intention of letting her do that. He needed to push her in a way that made her think she was still in control, while at the same time unraveling the last threads of her deception. He could sense that there was more to her story, and now he had to find a way to extract it. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the desk. "You say your father killed Henrietta," he repeated, "but why not simply leave the past buried? Why bring it all up now when your father is dead?" Evelyn's eyes flickered, just for a split second, but it was enough. There was the faintest hint of panic in her expression before she quickly masked it with the same carefully composed face. Larkin could see the cracks beginning to show. She had been holding something back, and the more he pressed, the more it seemed to unravel. "I don't know what you mean," she stammered. "My father he was always a complicated man. But I was just trying to protect the family. I was trying to protect him." Larkin's voice remained soft, almost conversational, though his words were sharp. "Protect him from what?" "He's dead now, Miss Rivington. You've told me the truth about Henrietta, but the way you're reacting tells me there's something more. Something you haven't told me yet." Evelyn's eyes darted toward the window, the weight of the storm outside almost matching the one in the room. She looked desperate now, but also calculating. Her mind was working fast, weighing the consequences of every word she could say. Then, as if deciding that silence would no longer protect her, she turned back to Larkin. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying," she said quickly, her voice low but fierce. "But I couldn't let the truth come out. If people knew what really happened with Henrietta, what my father did, they would ruin everything. The family, the estate, everything we've built over the years. It would all be destroyed." Larkin's eyes narrowed, a flicker of realization washing over him. The fear in her voice wasn't just about the murder, it was about something far more powerful. The Rivington name, their legacy, the life they had built on the foundation of secrets. But that's not why you killed him, is it? Larkin pressed. It wasn't just the past that drove you to murder your father. Her lips trembled, but she refused to speak. Larkin knew he was close now. He could see it in the way her body language shifted. The walls she had so carefully constructed were beginning to crumble, and the truth was just beyond her grasp. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant sound of the grandfather clock ticking away the minutes. Larkin needed to push her further, and he knew exactly how to do it. He had one trick left, one that might finally force her to reveal the missing piece. Without warning, he stood up from his chair, the sudden movement catching Evelyn off guard. He walked over to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the manor grounds. He didn't say anything at first, but the silence in the room grew heavy, pressing down on them both. Evelyn's gaze shifted to him, and Larkin could feel her unease growing. He was playing on her need for control. People like her, the privileged, the powerful, hated feeling exposed, hated being caught off guard. And that was exactly what Larkin was doing. He was making her feel uncomfortable, like she was losing her grip on the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying an edge. Miss Rivington, I've been thinking about the night of the murder, about the chessboard, and about how everything seems to have pointed to your father's death being a simple inheritance matter. But what if it wasn't? What if the game he was playing wasn't just about the estate? What if it was about something far more personal? Evelyn's eyes widened slightly, her breath hitching. She hadn't expected him to speak in such a way, calm, detached, as though he were merely theorizing. She thought he was still in the dark, but now she knew he was much closer to the truth than she'd realized. Larkin turned back to face her, his gaze piercing. What if your father wasn't just a victim of a family grudge, but part of a much larger, much darker game, a game he thought he could control, but one that spiraled out of his reach? Evelyn's composure faltered for just a moment, her eyes darting to the chessboard on the table. She was calculating, but now she was cornered. The subtle change in her expression told Larkin everything he needed to know. The mask she had carefully crafted was slipping, and with it, her entire narrative began to unravel. She took a step back, her voice a strained whisper. You don't understand. It wasn't just about Henrietta. It was about my father's obsession with the past. He thought he could erase it. He thought he could fix it all, but it was too late. It had already caught up with him, and now it's caught up with me. Larkin took a step toward her, his presence dominating the room. The obsession. He murmured, that's what drove him. Not just guilt, but a fear of being exposed. And you wanted to protect him, protect the legacy. But it's too late, Miss Rivington. The truth is already out. She looked at him with a mix of fear and resignation. It's too late for all of us, she whispered, her voice barely audible. And in that moment, Larkin knew this wasn't just about a murder anymore. This was about a family's legacy of lies, a deep-seated fear of exposure that had driven them all to madness. Evelyn hadn't just killed her father out of greed or revenge. She had killed him to preserve something far more fragile than money, her own sense of control over a past that could never be erased. The game was over, and the pieces had all fallen into place. The only thing left now was to confront the final truth. The morning after Evelyn's confession, the atmosphere at Everbrook Manor seemed colder than ever, as though the house itself had absorbed all the lies and secrets that had spilled within its walls. Larkin's mind was still racing, piecing together everything he had learned, Evelyn's motives, her father's dark past, and the web of deception that had been woven over the years. Yet, despite his progress, there was still something off, a nagging feeling that, no matter how much he uncovered, someone was always one step ahead, obscuring the truth. He had been up since dawn, reviewing the case files again, retracing his steps and revisiting the details. But just as he felt he was on the verge of uncovering the final threads, something happened, something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos. It started when Williams, the constable, entered the study with a strange, apprehensive look on his face. "Inspector," he said, voice tight, "there's been a problem. The chessboard, it's gone." Larkin's heart sank. For a moment, He could hardly believe it. The chessboard, the key to everything, had been sitting on the table just hours ago. He'd been over it again and again, studying the positions of the pieces, searching for the smallest clue that could push him toward the final revelation. Gone? Larkin echoed, a bitter edge to his voice. How Williams' jaw tightened, his eyes avoiding the detective's gaze. I don't know, sir. I went to check it just now, and it's gone, disappeared. No sign of a break-in, no forced entry. Just gone. Larkin stood, his mind quickly running through every possibility. Had someone taken it? Had someone realized how close he was to the truth and acted to destroy it? The thought was chilling, but it made perfect sense. The closer he got to the core of the Rivington family's secrets, the more desperate someone would become to bury the truth. He stormed to the study table, his eyes scanning the room. The chessboard was indeed gone. The pieces were scattered. But the one thing that had stood out, the ivory knight, was now missing. His pulse quickened. Whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were doing. The knight wasn't just a game piece. It was a message. It held the key to understanding the entire crime. Larkin's mind raced. Who had the most to lose if the truth came out? Evelyn was still his prime suspect. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about her. The whole family had been hiding something, and now someone was actively working to ensure it stayed buried. Have you spoken to the staff? Larkin asked Williams, his voice cold and measured. I've spoken to everyone, Sir. Williams replied. No one's seen anything unusual. No one's confessed to taking the chessboard. Then they're lying. Larkin muttered under his breath. The truth was being buried right in front of him, and he couldn't afford to let it slip away. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. We'll speak to the family. I want everyone in the drawing room within the hour. It didn't take long for the family to gather in the large, dimly lit drawing room. Evelyn entered first, her face as composed as ever. But there was something about her stance that made Larkin suspicious. She was playing a part, but the act was wearing thin. Olivia followed, her expression unreadable, and then Clements, the butler, entered last, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Larkin stood before them, his gaze sweeping over each of their faces. Someone has taken the chessboard, he said bluntly. I want to know who. A tense silence fell over the room. No one spoke for a long moment, as though each person was trying to decide how to respond. Evelyn was the first to break the silence, her voice tight. I have no idea what you're talking about, Inspector, she said, her voice cool. What does the chessboard matter? My father's dead. The will is the only thing that should concern you now. Larkin watched her closely. Her words were rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed her there was a flicker of panic in them, just the slightest tremor in her gaze that gave her away. She was hiding something. But was she the one who had stolen the chessboard? Or was she simply a player in someone else's game? Olivia. Larkin turned to the older daughter, who had been unnervingly quiet. She had the same air of cold composure as her sister, but Larkin had already noticed how she seemed to shrink back. Whenever the conversation turned toward the past, it wasn't guilt, it was fear. I don't know anything about it, Olivia said flatly, though her fingers were twitching at her side, betraying her calm exterior. If it's so important, why don't you ask Clements? The butler straightened at the mention of his name, his usual stoic expression flickering for the briefest moment. I assure you, I know nothing about the chessboard's disappearance, sir, he said, his voice smooth to smooth. It's most unfortunate, of course, but we're all concerned with more pressing matters. Larkin's eyes narrowed. There it was again, the sense that someone was hiding something. The butler's response was almost too perfect, too well-constructed. He was hiding something, and Larkin was certain of it. But why would Clements be involved? What could he gain by stealing a chess piece? Where were you last night, Clements? Larkin asked, his voice quiet but insistent. I was in my quarters, sir, Clements replied smoothly. As I always am at that time of night. I assure you, I've had no part in this. Then how do you explain the fact that the chessboard has disappeared? Larkin pressed. You were the one who handled it last, weren't you? You were the one who placed it on the table after the body was discovered. Clements stiffened, his eyes flashing for a brief moment before he regained his composure. I placed it there, yes, but I did not steal it, Inspector." Larkin didn't miss the small but significant hesitation in Clement's voice. He had cracked. There was something more here, something deeper that wasn't being said. Someone had taken the chessboard, but Larkin still couldn't figure out why. And as he stared into Clement's eyes, a sickening thought crossed his mind. What if the theft was just a distraction? What if the real evidence had been destroyed already? Suddenly, Larkin had a horrible realization. The true evidence wasn't the chessboard, it was the hidden connections, the ones that had been buried deep within the family's past. And if someone had stolen the chessboard to prevent him from connecting those dots, then it was clear there were forces at work here far more powerful than he had anticipated. Someone didn't just want to hide the murder, they wanted to bury the entire truth, and they were willing to go to any lengths to do it. Larkin turned away, his mind already calculating the next move. The stakes had just risen exponentially. Someone was actively working against him, trying to stop him from uncovering the truth. And now, more than ever, Larkin knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just dealing with a family full of secrets. He was up against a conspiracy that went far deeper than he had ever imagined. The game was no longer just a mystery. It was a battle, and Larkin had just become a pawn in someone else's game. Larkin couldn't shake the feeling of being cornered. The stolen chessboard was the least of his problems now. It was as though the whole investigation had taken on a life of its own, pulling him deeper into a labyrinth of deception. The family was unraveling in front of him, each new revelation raising more questions than answers. But the one thing that had remained constant was the presence of an unseen hand, working tirelessly to block his every move. Someone knew exactly how much Larkin had discovered, and someone was actively trying to stop him. As he sat in the study, alone for the moment, his thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of hurried footsteps outside the door. He didn't need to turn around to know that something was terribly wrong. The door burst open, and William stood in the doorway, his face ashen, his eyes wide with panic. "Inspector, you need to come quickly," he said, his voice strained. "It's Miss Rivington. She's gone." Larkin's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea what to make of this. Evelyn was gone. She had been a key part of the case, her tangled web of motives at the center of everything. Why would she leave now? And more importantly, why would someone let her disappear? "Where is she?" Larkin demanded, already rising from his seat, his pulse quickening. William's hands were trembling as he spoke. "Her room, sir. It's a mess. It looks like she left in a hurry. The servants found the door wide open and no sign of her. There's a note, but it's strange, sir. You need to see it for yourself." Larkin didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and followed Williams out of the room, every step feeling heavier than the last. They hurried down the long corridor, and the distant sound of the thunderstorm outside seemed to echo in Larkin's mind. The storm raging now both inside the house and out. When they reached Evelyn's room, Larkin stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space immediately. The bed was unmade, the furniture disheveled. Books and papers were strewn across the floor, as though someone had been in a rush to leave, knocking things over as they went. The strangest part, however, was the note on the pillow. Larkin approached it carefully, his eyes narrowing as he read the words scrawled hastily across the paper. "The truth will come, but not from you. It's already too late. It was never about the family. This is bigger than all of you. If you think you're in control, you're mistaken. Stay away from the Rivingtons, or you'll be next." Larkin's stomach churned. The message was clear. Someone was toying with him, but it was more than that. It was a warning, a threat, and it was signed with no name. Just an unsettling sense of finality that made Larkin's blood run cold. "Is there any sign of a struggle?" he asked, turning to Williams. The constable hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir. Nothing to suggest any violence. But there's something else. We found her personal belongings gone. No clothes, no jewelry. It's as though she just vanished into thin air." Larkin was already piecing it together in his mind. Evelyn had been taken, not of her own will, but by someone who had calculated every step. Whoever had written the note had known the exact moment to strike when the investigation was at its most volatile. They were watching, waiting for Larkin to make his move. And now Evelyn was gone. Another victim? Or had she willingly disappeared to escape the consequences of her confession? Larkin's mind raced as he stepped back into the hallway. His thoughts were scattered, fragmented. But there was one thing that stood out above all else. Evelyn Rivington wasn't just a victim in this game. She had played a part in it, willingly or unwillingly. And someone was now using her to send a message to him. Before Larkin could formulate a plan, there was another sudden commotion outside, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. He turned to see Olivia Rivington rushing toward him, her face pale and frantic. She was gasping for breath, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Inspector, you have to help her," Olivia cried. "It's Evelyn. She's been taken. You have to do something." Larkin studied her carefully, noting the frantic edge to her voice. He had seen this kind of desperation before, the kind that came when a person knew they had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. But there was more to Olivia's distress than met the eye. Was she truly worried about her sister? Or was this just another piece in the elaborate puzzle that had been set up around him? "Olivia, calm down," Larkin said, his tone firm but controlled. "What do you know about this? Where was Evelyn when she disappeared?" I don't know," Olivia stammered. "I went to her room this morning, but she was gone. The door was open, and the note." She stopped, her voice breaking as she looked at the note on the pillow. "That's the same note, isn't it? The one she left for you?" Larkin nodded, the weight of it sinking in. The note wasn't just for him, it was a direct challenge. Whoever was behind this knew he was close to the truth, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to stop him. "There's something bigger going on here," Larkin said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Someone is trying to make sure I don't get any closer. They're using Evelyn as leverage. But it's not just about her. It never was." Olivia's eyes widened. "What do you mean? What's going on? Why would anyone want to hurt Evelyn?" Larkin's gaze hardened, his mind flicking back to the earlier conversation with Evelyn. The fear in her eyes had been real, but so had the resolve. She had been hiding something that was far more dangerous than she had let on. The family's secrets ran deeper than he had imagined, and now they were costing him. "I think Evelyn knows more than she's telling us," Larkin said, his voice grim. "But whoever took her has made a dangerous mistake, because now it's not just about her anymore. It's about stopping me from finding the truth, and I won't let that happen." Just then, a loud bang echoed from the direction of the manor's front gates. Larkin's heart raced as he turned toward the sound, his instincts flaring to life. Without another word, he motioned for Williams to follow him. The gates were open wide. Standing at the threshold, a dark figure emerged from the shadows, their face obscured, but their posture unmistakable. The figure raised their hand slowly, a glint of something sharp catching the dim light. Larkin's heart pounded in his chest. The villain had made their move, and now it was clear the game was far from over. The glint from the figure's hand shimmered again, but as Larkin stepped forward into the lamplight spilling from the manor, he saw it wasn't a weapon, it was a silver letter opener. The person, cloaked and hooded, raised it in a deliberate, almost theatrical gesture and dropped it to the ground before vanishing into the night. Williams made to pursue, but Larkin held out a hand. "No, let them go," he said, stepping forward to pick up the object. It was ornate, old monogrammed with a faded "Are not Evelyn's, not Olivia's, Lord Arthur's." Larkin turned the letter opener over in his hand, frowning. This made no sense. Why now? Why return something that had no immediate significance? Unless it wasn't meant to be found at all. He looked up toward the manor, the storm clouds above pressing low, as though the sky itself were listening. Every movement from the unknown figure, every vanishing trace of Evelyn, and every tampered clue, they were calculated, not chaotic, but deliberate. This was a game, a precise one. Back inside, Larkin returned to the study and placed the letter opener on the desk. He dismissed Williams with a nod and shut the door behind him. He needed quiet, space to think, because something had shifted. That letter opener, it was wrong. Not because of what it was, but because of where it should have been. He scanned the crime scene photos again, taken from the night of Lord Arthur's death. The ivory night, the chessboard, the glass of brandy. the sealed letter still resting beside the desk. Except now he saw what had been missing all along. In the photos, the letter opener hadn't been there. He went cold. Why would a man seal a letter and then fail to leave behind the tool he used to open correspondence? Lord Arthur was meticulous, habit-bound, the sort of man who always kept a paper knife at hand, who would never misplace such a thing unless he hadn't sealed the letter himself, unless someone else had sealed it. After his death, Larkin moved. Quickly, retrieving the letter from evidence, he opened the envelope again, this time examining the wax seal more closely. He hadn't given it much thought earlier. It had seemed ordinary. But now, under the desk's lamp, he saw the subtle ridge around the seal's edge, a double impression. Someone had resealed it, carefully but not perfectly. He opened the letter. Its contents were brief. Lord Arthur's own handwriting, unmistakably authentic, but something felt off. The phrasing, the tone, too abrupt. Not the letter of a man worried about his will or his family legacy, not even about guilt, but a deflection, a gesture of farewell without revealing anything. It read more like it had been written in anticipation of discovery. Then he saw it again, that same strange phrasing Evelyn had used in her earlier outburst. The family would be destroyed. The same wording appeared in the letter. That wasn't coincidence. She had helped write this. And then the final click fell into place. Larkin stood suddenly, his breath catching. The patterns weren't just in objects or timelines, they were in the people, their speech, their behavior. Lord Arthur's chess games had always followed a predictable pattern: open with the king's pawn, shift to a Sicilian defense. He played the same rhythm for years, relying on rote memory and emotional control. But the board left behind had been out of sync. A bold knight sacrifice early in the game, a reckless bishop move. Arthur never played like that, but someone else had. Someone who wanted to mimic him, and in doing so, overplayed their hand. Larkin rifled through the folder again and found the staff logs. Clements, the butler, had once been an amateur player, often watching Lord Arthur's games. In a footnote scrawled by a former valet, there it was: Clements always pushes the knight early, sir, says he's too aggressive. Too aggressive. A cold weight settled in Larkin's chest. Clements had known the board, had placed the pieces. He'd been in the room that night, perhaps even before Lord Arthur's final breath. And then the letter opener returned deliberately, a red herring, but too late to mislead. Clements had been orchestrating pieces behind the scenes for longer than anyone suspected. The timeline began to sharpen in Larkin's mind. Evelyn had lied. Yes, but she wasn't the killer. She was covering for someone. Someone who had been watching the Rivingtons for decades, waiting for leverage, for cracks to form. He pulled open the drawer in the desk again. Dust outlined where the letter opener had once been, confirming it had sat here, undisturbed for years. Whoever had returned it had removed it after the murder, then reintroduced it to misdirect suspicion. Larkin stepped out into the hallway, his pace measured now, purposeful. The storm outside was building again, wind rattling the windows as though nature itself urged the final pieces into place. He found Williams near the stairs and spoke low. Don't let Clements leave the premises. Don't alarm him. Just keep him in view. Williams gave a short nod, his expression grim, then turned on his heel and vanished down the corridor. Larkin walked slowly back to the study, the stolen chessboard and Evelyn's disappearance still gnawing at his thoughts. But now he could see the outline of something much bigger than a single murder or a family inheritance. This was about control, about someone who had waited patiently, who had nudged every piece across the board until the family began turning on itself. Evelyn had known, maybe not the full picture, but enough to be dangerous. That was why she had been taken or coerced into disappearing. Her silence was worth more than her betrayal. Clements, the butler, unassuming, invisible, the kind of man you forget is in the room, even when he's standing beside you. The kind who learns everything and says nothing. And now Larkin realized the endgame had already begun. The patterns were there. And this time, it was the knight, the piece that moved in shadows and corners, who had made the final move. All Larkin had to do now was be ready for checkmate. Larkin's mind churned as he paced back and forth in the study, the walls closing in with every thought. He knew now that he was not just chasing a murderer. He was unmasking a much darker, deeper truth. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, but the final revelation still evaded him, hiding just out of reach like a shadow in the corner of his vision. He had one suspect, one person who had been at the heart of everything from the very beginning, Clemens. But there was more to it than that. The letter opener, the chessboard, the stolen night, the manipulations and half-truths woven into every interaction. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't even about revenge. Something far more sinister had driven this chain of events, something buried beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. Larkin's gaze fell on the chessboard once again, still sitting on the table like some grim monument to the twisted game being played around him. The knight, so out of place in its position, was no longer just a symbol of strategy. It was a mirror to the mind of the person who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The moves made in this game weren't about the Rivington fortune. They were about something far more fundamental: control, power, the manipulation of everyone around them. And as he stood there, lost in the shifting currents of his thoughts, it all clicked into place. Clemens wasn't just a butler. He wasn't just a man hiding in the shadows, waiting for a moment to seize power. He had been playing a game of his own all along, and the Rivington family had been nothing more than pawns in his twisted version of chess. The real question now was why? Why go to such lengths? Why destroy lives, manipulate motives, orchestrate murders? The answer lay in something far deeper than greed. It lay in the one thing Clemens had never had: respect. Larkin turned sharply, his mind racing with the implications. His first instinct had been to think of the family's wealth, of the obvious greed that had been woven into every action. But it wasn't about money. It wasn't about the estate. Clemens had wanted something more than that, more than a title, more than riches. He wanted recognition, a place in a world that had always overlooked him. Clemens had been the perfect servant for decades, quiet, efficient, loyal to a fault. He'd been the shadow at the edges of every Rivington gathering, a fixture in the background, unnoticed, uncelebrated. But in the recesses of his mind, Larkin knew. He had always dreamed of more. He had watched Lord Arthur from the periphery, learning every nuance of his life, every flaw, every moment of vulnerability. But the butler had never been seen. His contributions had been invisible, his presence ignored. Lord Arthur, a man of pride and arrogance, had always kept Clemens at arm's length, treating him as little more than a servant, a tool to be used and discarded. And that had been the final straw. Clemens had had enough. It wasn't the Rivington fortune that had driven him to murder. It was the deep-seated need for acknowledgement, to be seen as someone more than just a footnote in someone else's story, to break free from the chains of invisibility and finally step into the light. Larkin's breath hitched as he thought of the subtle signs that had been so easy to overlook. Clemens' obsession with the chess games, the way he had watched Lord Arthur's every move, mimicking his tactics, learning his strategies. And now, he had turned those skills on the Rivington family, orchestrating a deadly game to ensure his place in history. It was a twisted form of pride, a belief that the world owed him something, that if he couldn't be the heir to the Rivington fortune, he would instead claim ownership of their lives, their future, their legacy. Larkin's hands clenched into fists. Clemens had been manipulating the family from the start, feeding on their insecurities, their greed, their weaknesses. He had been patient, waiting for the right moment to strike. And that moment had come when Lord Arthur had been vulnerable, when the family's future had been at its most unstable. The death of Lord Arthur wasn't just an opportunity to seize the estate. It was an opportunity to control the narrative, to take center stage after years of being cast aside. And now, with Evelyn's disappearance, Larkin realized the next phase of the plan was already in motion. Clemens hadn't just killed Arthur. He had been methodically eliminating anyone who could stand in his way. Evelyn had known too much, and now she was gone, hidden away, or perhaps worse, silenced for good. Her silence, her absence, was just another move in Clemens' game. The realization hit Larkin like a physical blow. He had been so focused on motives driven by power and wealth that he hadn't seen the psychological depth of the crime. Clemens wasn't just a murderer. He was a man consumed by the need to be seen, to be recognized, to finally make his mark. He had been willing to destroy everything in his path to ensure his own legacy, to become someone who would be remembered. Larkin's heart pounded as he turned toward the door. There was no more time to waste. Clemens was still in the house, still weaving his web, and Larkin had to act before the butler's twisted game reached its final, deadly conclusion. He moved quickly through the halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He had to find Clemens now. He had to end this before the last, fatal move was made. As he reached the foot of the staircase, Larkin heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. He froze, listening intently. The figure who stepped into view was not Clemens, but Olivia. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression frantic. "Inspector, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. "Clemens, he's gone. I think he's planning something terrible." Larkin didn't need to hear any more. He had already figured it out. Clemens was making his final play, and he was going to stop him before the butler could claim victory. "Where is he?" Larkin asked sharply, his voice low and urgent. "I don't know," Olivia whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "but I've seen him. He's been moving in and out of the servants' quarters, and I think he's trying to leave the house." Larkin didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel and headed for the back exit. He could feel the pieces of the game shifting, the final act unfolding in front of him. The butler was about to make his move, and Larkin had no intention of letting him win. Larkin's pulse quickened as he moved swiftly down the narrow hallway toward the servants' quarters. The manor seemed quieter now, the storm outside only adding to the sense of impending dread. Every step felt heavier, as though the very walls were closing in on him, pushing him toward the final, unavoidable confrontation. Clemens had made his play, and it was only a matter of time before the butler's manipulations came crashing down around him. Olivia had been right. Clemens had been planning something. He hadn't been subtle in his movements, the quiet, practiced way he slipped in and out of rooms, his hands always busy with something. It was clear now that he had been preparing for an escape. But where would he go? And what was his ultimate goal? Power, recognition, a place in the world he had never been able to occupy? The last piece of the puzzle clicked into place as Larkin reached the back door. He had been so focused on Clemens' obsession with control, so consumed by the idea of the butler's thirst for recognition, that he had overlooked the simplest explanation. Clemens wasn't planning to run. He was planning to finish it all. The chessboard, the letter opener, Evelyn's disappearance, they were all part of the grand finale he had orchestrated in his mind. And now he was preparing for the final move. Larkin turned to Williams, who was waiting just outside the door. His gaze was steady, his face grim. He knew what was coming, and he had no intention of getting in the way. "Stay here," Larkin said quietly. "Make sure no one leaves the house, no one gets in or out." Williams nodded, his expression sharp with understanding. Larkin entered the servants' quarters, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. The air was thick with tension, each creak of the floorboards beneath his feet amplifying the silence. He moved cautiously, aware that Clemens could be anywhere watching, waiting. But he knew one thing for certain now. The butler's final act was already in motion, and it was a move that would not be stopped. Suddenly, a faint sound echoed from behind a door at the far end of the hall, the soft scrape of a chair being moved. Larkin's heart raced. He wasn't alone anymore. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the doorknob. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, he could just make out the figure of Clemens. The butler was hunched over a table, his hands working feverishly. There, on the table in front of him, was the chessboard, the same one that had been left behind in the study, the same one that had been disturbed. Larkin didn't hesitate. He pushed the door open with a swift motion, stepping inside, his eyes locked on Clemens. "Clemens," Larkin's voice rang out, cool and composed despite the tension in his chest. "It's over." The butler froze, his hands trembling over the chessboard. He didn't turn around immediately, as though unwilling to face the inevitable. But Larkin could see it in his posture, the defeat, the resignation. Clemens had known this moment was coming, and now it was finally here. "You've been playing a dangerous game," Larkin continued, his voice unwavering. "And now you've lost." Clemens slowly turned to face him, his face pale, his eyes wide but strangely calm. There was no fear in him, just an eerie, quiet acceptance. "I was never supposed to be invisible," Clemens said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not in my own life. Not after all these years." Larkin stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the butler, the man who had spent decades hiding in plain sight, who had watched and learned, who had been passed over by the very people he had served. "You've always been the one holding the pieces, Clemens," Larkin said, his voice low, as if speaking to a child. "But you've never understood the game." Clemens' lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "I understand it perfectly. I just never had the opportunity to play." Larkin's gaze flicked to the chessboard on the table. The pieces were arranged in a curious pattern, the knight his knight was positioned in a place of power. And then he saw it. The board was set up for a checkmate. "You've been playing both sides, haven't you?" Larkin said, his mind working quickly. "First, you take control of the game by moving the pieces around. Then, you use the family's weaknesses to keep them in check. You set them up, manipulated them into playing your game." Clemens didn't answer. His gaze was fixed on the chessboard, his fingers now lightly tracing the edges of the pieces. His obsession was consuming him, pulling him deeper into the narrative he had crafted, the game he had constructed. But it was all a charade. The truth was simpler. He had wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be respected, and in the process, he had destroyed everything around him. Larkin continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "You killed Lord Arthur because he represented everything you despised: his wealth, his power, his position. He had everything you wanted, everything you thought you deserved." Clemens' smile faltered for a moment, but he didn't speak. His hands trembled again, his eyes shifting toward the door, as if considering his options. "And you took Evelyn because she was the only one who could stop you. She knew the truth. She knew you'd been orchestrating this whole thing, and she had to be removed before she could expose you," Larkin said, his voice harder now. The pressure mounting, Clemens' eyes locked onto Larkin's, and for the first time, the butler seemed to see the detective for who he truly was: not a pawn, not a piece in his game, but the very force that would bring it all crashing down. "You don't understand," Clemens said, his voice thick with something that wasn't quite emotion, something darker. "You don't understand what it's like to be invisible, to be nobody. I had to do this. I had to make them see me." Larkin took another step forward, his eyes never leaving Clemens. "You were never invisible, Clemens. You were just hiding behind your lies, your manipulation. You were playing a game, but you forgot that in the end, it's not about the pieces you move. It's about the lives you destroy to get there." There was a long silence between them as Clemens slowly exhaled, his shoulders slumping. He looked at the chessboard one last time, then back at Larkin, his face stripped of any remaining pride. "I wanted to be remembered," he muttered, his voice hollow. Larkin didn't say another word. He stepped closer, and before Clemens could react, the detective had him by the arm, guiding him toward the door. It was over. The game had ended, and as the butler was led away, Larkin knew the pieces had finally fallen into place. The final move had been made. The manor was eerily still as Larkin led Clemens to the sitting room. The butler's shoulders slumped in defeat. It seemed like the case had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. For hours, Larkin had gone over the details, piecing together every fragment of the puzzle. Clemens had been the mastermind all along, the quiet, invisible figure who had manipulated the Rivingtons with a subtlety and precision that had left everyone blind to his actions. He was the one who had pulled the strings, the one who had set the traps. And now, with the confession in hand, it felt like the curtain had fallen on the entire drama. Larkin couldn't help but feel a slight sense of satisfaction, the kind that only came when a case that had seemed impossible finally clicked into place. He had seen through Clemens' carefully crafted charade, and now the man would face the consequences of his actions. But as the butler was seated before him, his hands bound in front of him, a strange feeling tugged at the back of Larkin's mind, an uneasy sensation that something wasn't quite right. The door creaked open, and Olivia Rivington entered, her expression taut with the strain of everything that had unfolded over the past few days. Larkin noticed she was holding a letter in her hand. She approached slowly, her eyes flicking between Clemens and Larkin. There was something new in her demeanor, something sharp, almost calculated. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady, "I think you need to see this." Larkin's eyes narrowed as he turned to face her. "What is it?" Olivia extended the letter toward him, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it out. "It's from my father." Larkin took the letter and unfolded it, the paper thick and heavy, the handwriting neat and deliberate. The words on the page were simple, but the message hit him like a slap to the face. "To my dear Olivia, if you are reading this, then my time has come. I have left you everything, but there is one thing I must ask of you: look after your brother. The Rivington legacy is not just about wealth or power. It is about something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. The game we have been playing for so long is not yet over. Do not trust Clemens, your father." Arthur Rivington. Larkin's pulse skipped. His eyes locked onto Olivia's, searching for answers. This wasn't what he had expected. Why would Lord Arthur, if he had known he was going to die, leave a cryptic message like this? Why had he written about Clemens when the butler was already the prime suspect? A chill swept through the room. Olivia's face was unreadable. She had been quiet throughout the entire investigation, her grief and confusion masking the complexity of the situation. But now Larkin couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. The letter, so unexpectedly placed in his hands, seemed too convenient, too pointed. "Why didn't you tell me about this earlier?" Larkin asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "Why wait until now?" "I didn't want to believe it," she said, her voice tight. "But my father was always so calculating. He planned for everything, even this." Larkin's mind raced. The last-minute twist was becoming clear. He had thought Clemens was the mastermind, the man who had manipulated everything from the shadows. But now, the letter had introduced a new possibility. Lord Arthur had known something was wrong, and he had left this final message, almost as if he had anticipated his own death. "You're saying your father knew something was going on with Clemens?" Larkin pressed, his eyes not leaving her face. Olivia's gaze flickered toward Clemens, who had been silent this entire time, his eyes cast downward. "Yes," she said slowly, her voice faltering for the first time, "but I don't know what it means. I only found the letter after you had arrested him." Larkin's instincts were on fire. There was more to this than met the eye. Clemens might have been the one who had played the game, but someone else had set the pieces in motion. Lord Arthur had been onto something, but had he known about Clemens' true intentions? Or had he been manipulated into setting a trap for his own family? He looked back at Clemens, whose face had gone pale at the mention of the letter. A small muscle in his jaw twitched, his eyes briefly flicking to Olivia before he composed himself again. "You knew about the letter, didn't you?" Larkin asked, his voice hard. "Your silence earlier tells me everything. You knew about Lord Arthur's suspicions. Did you think you could control the narrative even after his death?" Clemens didn't answer immediately. His fingers curled into fists, and for a moment, Larkin thought he might try to deny it all. But instead, the butler met his gaze with an almost resigned calm. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," Clemens said, his voice rough, as though the weight of his guilt was catching up to him. "Arthur knew I was manipulating things, but he didn't understand. He thought he could control the game, that he could keep me beneath his thumb. But he was wrong. I didn't just want his wealth or his title, I wanted what he had that I could never have." His position. Larkin stood motionless, piecing the final parts together. Lord Arthur's suspicions had been correct. Clemens wasn't just after wealth, he wanted recognition, but more than that. He wanted the power that came with being the one who controlled everything from the shadows. And in his mind, the only way to achieve that was to erase everything that stood in his way. "Then, why didn't you act sooner?" Larkin asked, his voice low. "Why wait until after Lord Arthur's death to make your move?" Clemens' gaze dropped to his hands, his expression flickering with something close to regret. "Arthur's death was an accident. I didn't plan it. But once he was gone, the game was mine to finish. I just needed the right pieces. Evelyn, Olivia, didn't matter who I used. I just needed them to trust me." Larkin took a step back, the weight of Clement's confession hanging in the air. It was all coming together now. But there was one last detail he couldn't ignore. Olivia, Olivia, Larkin said, turning toward her. How much of this did you know? Her face remained neutral, but her eyes betrayed her. She was holding something back. I didn't know everything, she replied, her voice steady. But I knew my father was planning something. I knew Clemens was involved. Larkin's mind raced. Could she have been in on it? Was this all part of a larger scheme, a game orchestrated by the Rivington family themselves, with Clemens as their unwitting pawn? Just as the pieces began to fall into place, there was a sudden noise, a sharp, jarring sound from outside the room, a crash, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps hurrying panicked. Larkin's heart skipped a beat. Something was wrong. The case wasn't finished yet. Far from it. The real mastermind might still be hiding in plain sight. The crash from the hallway sent an icy chill through the room. Larkin's instincts kicked in immediately. He turned toward Olivia and Clemens, his hand already on the door before either could say a word. The sound had come from just outside. Someone had breached the threshold, and the urgency of it all didn't feel like a mere accident. Stay here, Larkin ordered, his voice a low, urgent command. Olivia opened her mouth to protest, but Larkin was already moving, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had thought the case was resolved. Clemens had confessed. The puzzle had appeared complete, neatly tied up in a bow, with the butler's guilt at the center of it all. But now, there was something more, something that lingered, as if the entire web of lies had only been partially unraveled. Something was still wrong. He moved quickly, his shoes barely making a sound on the old wooden floors. As he approached the door, he caught sight of a shadow slipping through the narrow hallway, a figure moving swiftly, too quickly to be anyone from the house staff. His heart pounded in his chest, and a sinking feeling gripped his gut. He stepped out into the hall just in time to see the figure dart around a corner. Larkin's hand grasped the banister as he turned the corner, his senses heightened, his every nerve alert. The figure ahead was nearly at the exit, just a few steps away from the grand door that led to the outside world. But it wasn't Clemens. Larkin's breath hitched as he recognized the figure's movements. Olivia. She was running. Her hair had come loose from its elegant bun, and she moved with a wild desperation that Larkin hadn't seen in her before. For a split second, he thought about calling out to her, asking her to stop, but the words were lost in the pounding of his heartbeat. He couldn't let her escape. Not now. Not when everything was about to make sense. He pushed forward, faster, now closing the distance between them. She had almost reached the door when he reached out and grabbed her arm, spinning her round with a force that made her stumble. Her eyes were wide, her breath ragged from exertion, and the fear in them was palpable. Olivia, stop, Larkin demanded, holding her firmly but not roughly. Where are you going? Her eyes darted around the hallway, and for a moment, she didn't answer. Then, with a tremor in her voice, she spoke. Please, let me go. I have to know. Larkin said, cutting her off. You've been running this whole time, hiding behind your father's death and Clement's confession. It's time to stop. Olivia looked up at him, her expression shifting, morphing into something darker, more guarded. For the first time, Larkin saw something other than the frightened woman who had appeared so lost and confused. This was the face of someone who had been playing a part, who had been waiting for the right moment to make her move. I never wanted this to happen, Olivia said, her voice barely a whisper. But I had no choice. Larkin's grip tightened. No choice? You had a choice when you decided to involve yourself in this twisted game. Olivia's eyes flickered with something like regret, but there was no true remorse. She wasn't trying to justify herself. She was trying to make him understand the desperation that had led her down this path. Everything was falling apart. She murmured, Father had been planning something for years. He was afraid. And when he started seeing Clemens as a threat, I knew what had to be done. It wasn't just about power, Inspector, it was about survival. Larkin's mind whirled. The pieces were falling into place, but the truth was more complex than he had expected. Olivia wasn't just the grieving daughter. She had been the mastermind all along, pulling the strings behind the scenes. She had used Clemens, manipulated him, even killed her own father in a desperate attempt to secure her position within the family. "You killed your father," Larkin said, his voice cold. "You set everything in motion. You played Clemens, like a puppet, and when he got too close to the truth, you planned to escape before anyone could catch on." Olivia's eyes darkened, and for a moment Larkin saw the raw, ruthless ambition that had been hiding beneath her delicate exterior. "You think I'm the only one who's been manipulating people in this house," she spat, her voice shaking, with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You think Clemens was the only one playing the game? I wasn't going to let anyone destroy everything my father and I had built. I wasn't going to let them take away what was rightfully mine." Larkin felt the weight of her words settle around him like a thick fog. She had always been there, playing her part, grieving, innocent, swept up in the tragedy of her family's downfall, but it was all a facade. Olivia had been the one who orchestrated it all. She had set the trap, luring Clemens into a deadly game he never even knew he was a part of. Her confession hung in the air, and for a moment Larkin considered his next move. The door to the outside was within reach if he didn't act quickly. She would slip away into the night, just as she had planned, but he wasn't about to let that happen. Not now. Without a word, Larkin pulled out his handcuffs and slapped them onto Olivia's wrists, the cold metal closing around her with a finality that sent a jolt through both of them. "You're under arrest," Larkin said firmly, "for the murder of your father, the manipulation of Clemens, and the orchestrating of everything that happened in this house." Olivia's face twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words faltered on her lips as she realized the game was over. The detective had seen through her every move, every lie, every act. The rush of adrenaline faded, leaving behind a strange, almost suffocating silence. Larkin stepped back and allowed the weight of the situation to sink in. The case had taken unexpected turns, but in the end, it was clear who had been pulling the strings. He glanced over at Clemens, who was still sitting in the sitting room, staring blankly at the floor. The butler had been a pawn in Olivia's game, a man used and discarded once his usefulness had expired. He had been a tool, not a true mastermind. Larkin's mind flashed back to the final moments with Clemens, the way he had tried to hide the truth, the way he had been so sure of his own victory. But in the end, it had been Olivia who had won, and now she would pay the price for her ambition. As Olivia was escorted out of the house, her eyes met Larkin's for one last time. There was no remorse in her gaze, only the cold, calculating reflection of someone who had thought she could outplay the game. But in the end, the truth had caught up with her. The Rivington legacy would never be the same. The tangled web of lies, manipulation, and murder had come to an end. But the scars it left behind would last far longer. Justice had been served, but the sense of finality felt hollow. Something about this case, something about Olivia's final look told Larkin that there was always another layer to uncover, another secret waiting to be revealed. For now, though, the game was over. The pieces had fallen into place. The rain had stopped, though the clouds still loomed heavy in the sky, casting a dim, oppressive light over the estate. The manor, once filled with the frenzied whispers of the guilty and the innocent, now stood silent. Larkin stood at the edge of the driveway, watching as the police cars pulled away with Olivia in the back. The last of the storm had passed, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed against him. He should have felt victorious. After all, the case had been solved. Olivia had confessed. The Rivington legacy was being dismantled, and Clemens, for all of his manipulations, was now just a footnote in a much larger story. Yet, as Larkin stood there, the nagging sensation wouldn't go away. Something was missing. He glanced back at the manor, the building now eerily quiet. There had been a sense of finality in the air when Olivia had been taken away, but something deep inside him still felt unsettled. The case had been complicated, layers of deceit, murder, manipulation, but there had been a clarity about it in the end. Olivia's confession had tied everything together, offering an explanation for her role in the deaths, the games, the lies. So why did he still feel like there was one last secret, hidden somewhere just out of reach? Larkin's eyes flicked to the nearby garden where the morning dew still clung to the petals of the flowers. Their colors washed out in the overcast light. It was a beautiful sight, serene in its quietude. But in his mind, the pieces of the puzzle were still turning, shifting, rearranging themselves in patterns he couldn't yet understand. "Inspector." The voice startled him, though he had sensed someone's approach moments before. He turned to find Williams, his ever-constant partner, stepping from the shadows. His expression unreadable. "They've taken her away," Williams said, his gaze scanning the road, almost as if searching for something, someone. "It's over, isn't it?" Larkin's eyes lingered on the distant horizon. He didn't answer immediately, his mind too far removed from the present moment. There was too much swirling in his head. A case that had seemed like a masterpiece of devious planning, the intricate threads finally pulled together in the end, yet something felt incomplete. "It's over," Larkin said at last, his voice low, tinged with an odd, lingering uncertainty. "But not the way I thought." Williams, ever perceptive, raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Larkin shook his head, his gaze still distant. "It's just too neat, too perfect." Olivia confessed. "Clemens was nothing more than a pawn, and the pieces all fit together, but there's a detail I can't shake. One small thing I missed earlier." Williams stepped closer, his brow furrowing. "What detail?" Larkin took a deep breath, his mind running back to the final moments of the case. It had been too quick, too clean. Olivia's confession, though satisfying, had felt almost too calculated. She hadn't been afraid, not really, not the way someone cornered with no way out would be. There had been an eerie calm about her, something almost rehearsed in her actions. "The letter," Larkin muttered, more to himself than to Williams. "The one from Lord Arthur. She gave it to me at just the right moment, right when I was about to arrest Clemens. The perfect distraction." Williams blinked, clearly confused. "I don't understand." "The letter was a confession. It led you straight to Olivia." "That's the problem." Larkin turned to face Williams, his voice steady but tinged with something darker. "Lord Arthur's letter wasn't just a warning. It was a message, one that we missed, a message to Olivia, and one that she knew would lead me down the wrong path. But we have her confession," Williams said, clearly still processing the implications of what Larkin was suggesting. "We've got everything we need." "No, we don't," Larkin said sharply. "I've been too focused on the big picture to see the little one. We're missing something small but important." The letter was a clue, yes, but it was also a misdirection. A thought occurred to him then, one that sent a shiver down his spine. What if Lord Arthur's warning had not been meant for Olivia? What if it had been a warning about her, a final attempt to reach out to the world, to reveal the truth before he died? Larkin felt a cold certainty settle in the pit of his stomach. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the truth was slipping just out of reach. Olivia's confession wasn't just about what she'd done, Larkin said, his voice quieter now, his eyes narrowing as he pieced the fragments together. It was about controlling the narrative. She wanted me to believe that she was the mastermind, that everything had led back to her. But what if that wasn't the case? What if Lord Arthur had been closer to the truth than we realized? What if he knew something we didn't? Williams was silent for a moment, then spoke, his voice low and uncertain. "You think there's someone else involved?" Larkin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned his gaze toward the horizon once more, as if trying to read the sky for an answer. The answer that would explain why, after all the revelations, the case still didn't feel finished. "I don't know yet," he said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of his realization. "But I think we've just scratched the surface." As he stood there, lost in thought, the nagging sense of unfinished business loomed over him like a dark cloud. The case had resolved, but the questions remained. Olivia was arrested, but there was a deeper, more insidious truth lurking beneath the surface. Larkin turned to walk away, his mind still churning with unanswered questions. The pieces of the puzzle half formed. There was more to the story, much more. And as he disappeared into the distance, leaving the estate behind, he knew that this case, like so many others, was far from over. The answers were still out there, waiting, and Larkin would find them. Some mysteries never truly end. They just wait to be solved again.